Hi, Audra. Thank you. And hello, everyone. Glad to have you here. I'm going to start with just a very quick look at what we're going to talk about today. First, we're going to go through an overview of big data and analytics to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. And more importantly, I'm hoping to get some of you excited about this topic. And I recognize many of you probably already know what these things are, so bear with us because the next topic really dives into an actual approach that you can use to elicit and specify requirements for these analytics projects. And we'll spend most of our time there. And at the end, I'm going to wrap up with a few key takeaways, things that you can action on immediately with your analytics projects. So let's get started. Whether you know it or not, big data and analytics are being used on you every day. The website ads displayed to you, the suggested products you buy, the coupons that get printed at the grocery store, maybe the insurance premium changes that you saw, or a recent diagnostic test that you had a doctor, all of those encompass big data and analytics now. If you look at the screen here, these are some examples from websites that I use regularly. One is for shopping and the other one is for professional connections. And if you look at the actual marketing ads that they're placing on the page, they're very much targeted at me, and they are spot on for things that are interesting and useful to me. And I'm going to share a story. Many of you have heard it, but some haven't. It's a relatively famous story from Target, and the story is that a guy actually started receiving mail ads from Target. And these ads in the mail were pushing pregnancy items on him. You know, he was so bothered by it that he actually marched into his local store and he tore into the manager there over this. He thought it was so inappropriate. Well, a couple weeks later, he had to come back and apologize to that same manager. It turns out his teenage daughter was pregnant, and Target figured it out before he had. And that, folks, is big data and analytics working. For better or worse, that's it. Now, let's take a stroll down memory lane for a minute. Back in time, you know, way back in the day before we had this thing called the Internet, we had to look up things, you know, look up people in a phone book. We had to be connected to a wall when we talked on the phone. We rented movies, and they were on physical cassettes, okay? We had to fold the maps that we read. We used library cards to get to our books at the library. We actually mailed inter-office memos, and we bought physical CDs, okay? Way back then, that is. Now, sometime between back then and now, the Internet has changed the world that we have lived in. The Internet was a game changer. So I always ask kind of what's next. Well, the reality is the Internet has led us to this thing called big data, because it's really easy now to collect massive amounts of information about users, whether they like it or not. So businesses can easily track, you know, where users go, what they buy, who are their friends, who are they calling, what ads are they responding to. And all of that's great, but the data isn't useful in and of itself because, well, it's big. There's so much of it, and that's why we need analytics. Analytics turns that massive amount of information into something useful, and it helps us glean the interesting tidbits out of that massive information. So with that, I'm going to argue that big data and analytics are today's game changers. We are currently seeing a huge transformation in our daily lives as a result of this big data and analytics space. As a consumer, you're going to run into it every time you buy, and as a business, we're changing how we run our organizations. Now, the nature of analytics is sometimes you're going to notice it, sometimes you won't. Sometimes it won't work out like you hoped, and sometimes it might be used for nefarious purposes. Now, you might be thinking, so what? I'm a business analyst or a product manager. I just show up when I do requirements on projects and I go home, right? Why does this matter to me? Well, first of all, if you haven't been on an analytics project yet, your day is coming. And in fact, if your IT executives aren't running analytics projects, they're behind, and I'm pretty sure they're going to launch one soon. But the reality is most organizations actually are already working on these projects. There's some data out there that shows 90% of the Fortune 500 companies are already using business analytics. And analytics aren't necessarily new. They're just getting more complicated. And that's partially because that set of data is growing exponentially, and it's partially because what we want to do with that data is getting more complex. But the good news is there are many IT projects out there that are in place to help make the analytics actually easier to use and work for us better. As another recent story that I just heard in the news, I think I just heard it this week, Amazon announced that they actually want to start shipping packages to you before you order them. It's called anticipatory shipping. They're actually trying to reduce how long it takes to get the purchase to you once you actually buy it, and they're going to do it by predicting what you buy before you actually buy it. And then they'll locate stuff that they think you're going to buy near you so that they could literally drop it at your door the same day that you click the button to purchase it. Right? And the way that they do this is big data and analytics. Before we go any further, I actually want to put a poll out to the audience. And I'd like you to think about which of these best describes your situation. So let me go ahead and push the poll out. If you could take a minute to click on your screen, select the answer that you think best describes your current situation. All right, I'm going to give you a minute to answer that. Looks like we have a few answers in, so let's go ahead and look at the results out of that poll. All right, so by far, most people are working on them and you're getting to work on them, so that's exciting news. I think the second part of this presentation is going to be most interesting to you. And this is also, almost 20% aren't really sure what's going on in their company, so you're probably going to hear more about it soon. And those, in that 23% who aren't working on them yet, they're coming, all right? So kind of interesting data there. All right, so let's get back to why you should care about this topic as a business analyst or a manager of BAs. Given the prevalence of these projects and what we expect to be more frequency of these projects, the reality is that all BAs, business analysts, need to be well-versed in the ins and outs in analytics and big data. You've got to know the topic, okay? Beyond that, you need to know how to elicit and specify requirements for these projects. And then on top of that, I'd like to think that we need to be in a place where we can help push our organizations to think about new ideas or creative solutions or new possibilities with analytic solutions. And I'll get into more why that's important in a little bit. But I feel like those are kind of the three areas that justify why we really need to be paying attention to this in our roles. The good news is we're not alone. There are people that specialize in analyzing and transforming data. They've been doing this for a long time. Many of them have PhDs in the particular topics. But that said, organizations can't afford to have things like missed business objectives or extraneous features developed. They can't have missed requirements. So as BAs, we have to apply our good analysis skills to these projects just like we would any other project. I want to take a minute before I go too much further and make sure that everybody understands what I am talking about when I say a business analytics project. Okay? These are strategic projects typically. And what they do is they take large and often highly complex data sets and they turn them into meaningful information from which conclusive decisions and actions can be derived. So again, we're taking highly complex data sets, we're doing some analysis on them, that gives us meaningful information, and from that information we can make decisions that allow us to actually take action. And those meaningful information results could be things like observations or recommendations or maybe even predictions about the future. And again, I said this before, analytics isn't new, but the reality is we have to get better and faster at making decisions using analytics, and evidence is demonstrating to us that we are actually able to do that with analytics. You can think about like executives used to use their gut feeling to make decisions, so analytics is actually showing that they're making better decisions now than they used to. There's a wide variety of types of analytics projects. In the past, organizations that deployed analytics projects primarily focused on what the industry would call descriptive analytics. This would be things like looking at reports that tell stakeholders what's happening or what is happening right now or what happened in the past in their organization. But recent trends indicate there's a shift towards more organizations using predictive analytics. Users analyze information to predict what might happen in the future as opposed to interpreting what happened in the past. This diagram here shows you the types of analytics across that spectrum, from descriptive at the bottom to things at the top that are more predictive. So for example, in the descriptive, it's looking at those reports and dashboards. In the middle, you might have things like looking at data sets for trends or patterns. And at the top, it's things like how do we optimize our business based on predictions that we can forecast out of the data. So it's more forward-looking. The term big data commonly refers to sets of data characterized by its volume, so that's how much data we have, its variety, which would be how diverse is that data, and the velocity, which is looking at how rapidly is that data flowing into our organization. As an interesting tidbit about big data, a commercial aircraft when it takes a 30-minute flight, it generates 10 terabytes of data. I thought that was absolutely fascinating when I heard it. And then it lands and it dumps the data, basically. All of this is great, but data isn't boring in and of itself, right? People don't look at data for fun. What we are seeing is that executives want to see more data, but what they really want is to look at dashboards that summarize the interesting things about that data. This is a key takeaway today I want you to make sure you grasp, is that executives are looking at the data so that they can make decisions, okay? They're not looking at it for fun. They are looking at it so that they can decide to do something in their business. I'm going to talk a little bit more about those decisions and how we identify them in a bit. I just saw an interesting TV show called Intelligence. I don't know if the show is going to make it. It's only had a couple episodes out so far, but I found it fascinating. And the show is really about big data. The storyline is that the lead actor has a chip embedded inside his head. It effectively hooks his brain up to the internet so he can sense things. He immediately will pull relevant data to the forefront of his mind, and then he can decide what to do with it. So, for example, he might see a face of a random person walk by, and he'll pull up all kinds of information from that person using facial recognition and the data that's basically in the internet. So at one point, he's standing in an empty warehouse. 3 guys walk into it. He looks at them. He immediately pulls the relevant data about them to recognize that they're bad guys, and he could act immediately. So in this particular case, he ducked behind some boxes so he wouldn't get shot. So the possibilities with big data are really cool. At the same time, I think that they're actually pretty scary, too, to think that could be our future. Big data and analytics, it's not going anywhere. Our lives are forever going to be different. That's why I called it a game changer earlier. We're going to continue to see changes in the not-too-distant future. Things like we're going to see cars that drive more safely than we can. So they're going to drive for us. Hospitals are going to diagnose our problems faster and more accurately. Everyone's going to have a lot of choices to go to college, and they're all going to be in their living room. Main Street USA is not going to seem like a simple small town anymore because the people and the places will be taken over by analytics. Drugstores are actually going to know you're thinking about becoming pregnant before you do, not just knowing when you are. And it's going to seem like we can predict the future because the data is that reliable. All right. So next I'm going to get into the actual requirements approach that you can use on your projects. These 4 steps break down an approach to elicit and specify requirements. We're going to go into each one of them in a lot more depth, but at a very high level, first we prioritize the work using these decisions. It's a little bit different than traditional projects. Then we can actually define how are the analytics results going to get used. Okay? So we get these outputs. How do those get consumed? Then we're going to specify the data requirements that support the analytics. And then finally, we're going to get into actually defining the requirements for the analysis itself that has to happen. On traditional projects, features can be prioritized by considering how they contribute to the overall business objectives. But in analytics projects, the features aren't sufficient to prioritize with, and I would argue they're actually less interesting. So instead, you're going to use business decisions. Specifically the business decisions that the solution is going to enable. So you're going to identify those and use those to do your prioritization. You need to consider how much do those individual decisions each contribute to satisfying the business objectives. And that's how you decide what your priority is going to look like. We had a project recently where the business stakeholders insisted they had to have 200 different reports. But when pressed to answer a question, which was, what decision are you going to make from that report? On each and every one of those reports, we quickly learned that they really only needed about 50 of them. So what happens is people feel like they need those reports. It's a bit of a security blanket to them. But most of them they're never going to look at, and if they do look at them, they're actually not doing anything with them. And those are the ones that we can quickly cut from scope. So simply ask the question why and various variations on each of those to figure out what do they really need. So you might ask, why do you need that information? What are you going to do that report? How would you use that dashboard? And those questions will help you zero in on what are the most important things to develop. Now, we can look at a couple different places to discover these decisions. First, we can simply talk to the people who make them. That would be things like doing interviews and brainstorming sessions with these executives, asking them what decisions do they think they want to make. We can also look at existing business processes to find the decision points in the process. okay? And then we can also look at reports that they have today or dashboards that they have today and determine what decisions are they making from those today, because those decisions might carry forward in the future. And then again, for each decision that you identify, you tie it back to a business objective to determine which are actually the important decisions. Here's a scenario that we're going to use as an example throughout this section. So I want to walk you through the scenario real quickly. So let's say you're an executive at a superstore, and you're really excited about putting new technology in your stores, and one of the first upgrades that you're going to add is a facial scanning system and flat screen TVs that are located along major aisles in the store. Now, the facial scanning system is going to identify who is the customer as they walk by the scanning point, and then the customer walks by a TV screen right after that, and you're going to display a customized ad for that shopper based on who they are, okay? Imagine that there are a whole bunch of short, like 3-second video clips, and the system's going to do some analysis to say, you know, this particular person likes this particular thing, and they care about these things, and we're going to pop up an ad just based on that information alone. So as a BA working through that particular scenario, the very first thing I'm going to do is create a process flow, a very high-level process flow that puts the analytics in context of the full scenario. So here's an example of the process flow for this scenario. So this is very similar to traditional projects, by the way. We would model a lot of things in process flows. But here we have one where the customer walks by the store scan area. They scan the face. We match that face to a profile. Based on that, we select an ad. We display the ad. And then we might update data based on the response to that ad, right? Did the customer actually purchase what we were trying to push at them? In the scenario that we're talking about, there's a handful of different decisions that get made, but kind of the key business decision you're trying to make is ultimately what video ad to display to the customer with their specific point in the store. And here are some examples of questions that we're trying to answer. So we're looking at things like, well, first of all, what is the actual question? But what are the possible answers to that question? Okay, what are the allowed answers or the types of answers we'd expect? And then we need to model what input or what data is needed to make the decision. And then we can model things like what knowledge or governance or business rules, maybe policy, things like that, have to be applied to make the decision. And then finally, what other decisions do I actually have to make first before I can make that decision? And there's a requirements model that you can use. It's called a decision requirements model or decision requirements diagram. And that is here on this slide for our scenario. Again, it's a very simple one, and I'm sure it's not complete, but it gives you the idea of what I'm talking about. Right in the center, we have our key decision that we're trying to make. Which video ad do I want to display to my customer? Okay? So the boxes are the decisions. Over on the left, we have the ovals. Those are the data inputs required to make the decision. And then on the right, the box with the curve shape at the bottom, those represent those knowledge sources, things like policies or know-how. Okay? So in our scenario, we want to select a video ad. Well, we need to know things like who are the customers, what is their buying history, what are the video ads themselves that I can choose from. Okay? So those are some of the inputs to this decision. We also need to know things like our advertising policies, maybe how our customers react to this type of personalization. So, you know, if they have negative reactions over seeing their own face in the video ad, we might want to dial back that level of personalization. We also need to know things like traffic levels in the store. You know, I can't show a long ad if it's a peak time because I've got a lot of people walking by the screen, so I want to keep them very, very short. So again, this is an example of a decision requirements diagram. This is adapted from some work by James Taylor, and I've got some links at the end of the webinar that will point you to more information on that model. Another requirements model that we can create is a decision tree. This is a model that helps us understand the actual detailed logic in making the decision. So again, here's a simple example for our scenario. First, do we recognize the customer? If not, then we only have one choice, and that's to display a very generic ad. But if we do, then we check to see, do we know anything else about them? And if so, okay, is it the holiday season? Maybe we want to have a personalized holiday ad that gets displayed. And if not, maybe we can use their gender and pick a somewhat targeted ad, if not very specific to them. We can also represent the decisions in the form of a table. So here's a simple portion of this scenario. Again, this decision table shows us the actual business rules in each column, so we can read it almost top to bottom. This is a really good way to verify with our stakeholders that the logic we are specifying is correct. Okay? So as one example, if the customer is recognized and we have their customer data available and there's a video ad available, then we can display a personalized ad. So that's rule number 1 in that decision table. One advantage of a decision table over a decision tree is it's really much harder to overlook a particular combination of factors that lead to specific outcomes. So this gives you a little bit of rigor that the decision tree does not necessarily offer. Other than that, they actually show very similar things. Also, the outcomes that are at the bottom of this table lead us directly to our functional requirements. So they kind of just pop out at you very obviously, so you can do some more requirement specification at that point. And again, these two models, there are some links at the end of the webinar that will point you to more information. Generally speaking, on our website, we have a lot more information about these types of models if you want to dig a bit deeper. All right, next in our requirements approach is we need to look at how are we going to elicit requirements for how the analytics are going to get used. Now, some analytics results are going to be used by humans to make a decision so that they can take an action themselves. So for example, executives who sit around a boardroom looking at dashboards, maybe they're trying to decide what is the strategy for the next quarter and how we're going to run the business. Okay? That's human usage of analytics. But many analytics results are used by other systems. So for example, when you go to the grocery store and at checkout they print out 10 coupons that are targeted towards you, that's systems and taking analytics outputs and doing something with them, right? So we're feeding the analytics results to a coupon printing system in this particular example, okay? Or when you see websites display personalized ads with information about you inside the ad, right, that's a system using the analytics results to do some targeted marketing. And at a fundamental level, you have got to understand this level of usage before you can do the right depth on your requirements themselves. If you're delivering analytics results to systems, the requirements are actually a lot less interesting. I find that fascinating, but I think it holds up. What's going to happen is you're going to have a whole bunch of external interface requirements you have to deal with, right? The more interesting requirements questions arise when people have to use the results themselves, because now you have to think about these kinds of things. The delivery mechanism of the results. So how is the information physically made available to the end user? What tools can they use to employ to view it, right? Can they open it in their email application? Maybe it's a portal. Maybe it's a mobile device that they need to be able to see the results in. We have to think about the format of the results, right? So how is that information delivered? Is it reports? Is it dashboards? Do they want raw data? Is it something else? And then the flexibility. This is a big one. To what extent must the user be able to manipulate the information once they get it, okay? Now, you might be sitting here thinking, is this set of requirements really any different than when I've in the past done reporting requirements? And the answer is yes and no. If the results need to simply be shown in a standard report, then yeah, it's really just like doing any other report, okay? So that absolutely happens. But what I'm seeing is analytics is shifting away from standard static reporting towards something more interactive and looking at more predictive analysis. So typically what we see is people want more flexibility. They want to be able to drill down in the data. They want to filter and look at the data. So for this, you need to do a lot more requirement specification. You might need to model the user interface requirements to fully capture sort of those degrees of flexibility. We had a system that we built for 4 sales. They were VP sales in a Fortune 500 company. So they owned major regional areas. And they each wanted to start with the same dashboard view every single day. Like 8 a.m., they wanted it in their inbox. But from that point, they all wanted to drill down and filter that data and manipulate it in different ways. They wanted to do some what-if scenarios as they explored those results, and they each had different types of things that they wanted to drill in. So that immediately added a level of complexity to the system that we were building in order to give them that kind of flexibility. And I think this is more indicative of the type of thing that we're seeing moving forward. All right, the next type of information that we need to capture is our requirements for data, the data itself, right? So these are not database requirements per se because we're not designing a database, but we are developing requirements so that someone else can do that. There's 4 types of data requirements that we're going to look at more closely. First thing, though, I want to emphasize that these requirements are some of the most important that you're going to have to write when you're dealing with analytics. A lot of them are going to look like non-functional requirements, and I'm emphasizing this because a lot of people skimp on non-functional requirement specification. It's boring, it's not interesting, or they don't know what to do. I don't know exactly what the issue is, but that is very, very dangerous on any project, particularly an analytics project. Okay? The other thing I want, as you're going through these 4 types of requirements, think about the life cycle of the data when you're identifying the requirements. How does the data come into the system? How does it leave it? Because there might be requirements related to the data in one part of that life cycle that are different than that data later in the life cycle. So let's first look at what do we need to specify around data sources. It's things like what data do you need, what attributes do you need from that data, where is that data coming from? Also, the sources in big data projects could be changing over time. So think about that, right? In the future, you may need to add new data sources pretty quickly. In our example scenario, we've got a couple up here, but as one of those, right, maybe we have a requirement that the facial recognition software in our scenario is going to source its facial images from social media profile images, right? So that's one place that we would source the data from. Data storage is a really big topic too, because the sizes of these data sets is potentially growing, right? So you have to think about how much data is there today and how much data volume is expected. How much data growth in the data volume is expected. The nature of big data is it could be growing, it could be exponentially growing, so you really have got to plan ahead for what am I going to need to store long term. So again, in our example, we might initially only have 150,000 customer records that have known facial images associated with them, but obviously we're expecting that to grow, so maybe we're predicting a 10x growth rate per quarter. So we need to let people know that who are designing these systems. And then maybe it's something like over time we're going to get additional images of each customer, so we want to store up to 5 of those, but not more than that. So we take the 5 most recent images of a person. We also have to think about the rules that govern the data that gets stored. Right? Do we need to take the data from disparate sources and transform it so that they could be used together in the same analysis? Things like, do we need to archive the data, or can we just get rid of it at some point? So in our example, maybe we need to think about how do we encrypt the raw customer data according to some legal policies around that personal information. And the last type, this 4th type, is around extraction of the data. This is things like how fast do users need to get the query results? Do you need real-time or batch data? That kind of stuff. So in our scenario, we need a very quick response time, right? Basically, once the customer's face has been scanned, we need to very quickly pop up a video ad. So I'm saying here something like maybe we need a 3-second response time of facial recognition. Otherwise the customer's going to be way beyond that TV displaying their ad, so it's not really relevant anymore. All right, now traditional data requirements models are great if you have structured data where you have things like objects and reliable attributes that you can plan for. But the nature of big data is it's often unstructured or maybe somewhere in the middle where it's only semi-structured. So in this unstructured data, right, it doesn't lend itself to representation in traditional rows and columns. Okay, so this is things like voicemails or text messages. Those would be examples of unstructured data. And the challenge with this data is you may not know what you're even looking for in the data. I have an example here. So software operated by a security-related government agency might scan internet traffic for instances of the word bomb. But they've got to see it in context to know if it's even of interest, right? Because that word has different meanings. So for example, bomb could indicate a terrorist threat, which they very much care about, or it could refer to a person jumping into a photo right before it's taken, as in a photo bomb. Or maybe they're just describing a bad play's opening night, right? The actor's bombed or something like that. So that's the thing. With unstructured data, you don't even know what you're looking for necessarily to pull out of it. It makes it very, very hard to model it. But the good news is most data at least has some structure to it in the form of things like metadata, right? So that's data about your data. Semi-structured data are going to be things like emails, image files, video files. And basically, with semi-structured data, because it has some metadata associated with it, that gives us a little bit of information at least that we can start to model the data structure and its content. So you might be able to use things like business data diagrams or ERDs, entity relationship diagrams, or data dictionaries to represent, whatever it is you do know about the data. Just know I think that this is probably one of the most challenging things about these projects. So let's look at our last part of our requirements approach, okay? The data alone isn't actually all that helpful because remember, it's big data. There's a lot of it. Transforming the data is really where the power of analytics comes through. I think of it as being like that computational engine within these analytics projects. So we've got to understand how is that data transformed, how is it manipulated, what calculations are done on it so we can get to those useful results. Business rules in an organization or industry standard calculations, those are the kinds of things that you may end up pulling in here. It's a very simple example. If you're trying to show some kind of results that talk about gross profit margins, even forecasting those, then you need to specify exactly how you calculate that gross profit margin. Okay? So those are the very simple example, but those are the types of things that we're talking about with those analysis. I like this quote that is up on the screen right now. I think it exemplifies the nature of analytics solutions. The major challenge with analytics often is that the possibilities are truly endless, right? There are so many unknowns, and we don't always know what we're looking for in them, right? So we don't always know what the full capability of our analyst solutions are. We can't even begin to imagine what we might know. Or what we might want to know, sorry. So, think about it. There's so much that's unknown. There's so many possibilities opening up to us, and it's naturally going to lend itself to a bit of a creative process because of that. However, there are a couple of things that we can do to at least open our minds to think outside the box and come up with potential solutions and potential ideas, right, to explore those areas of the unknown. So the first thing is drill into whatever time frame it is the stakeholders want to analyze, right? Just understand, are they looking for insights about the past, or do they want to know what's going on right now so they can do something, immediately? Or maybe they want to look at what's most likely to happen in the future so that they can take action that way, right? One of the most valuable aspects of analytic solutions is that they enable this future thinking, future state strategic analysis. It's exploring sort of those what-if scenarios, right? What if the customer could receive their product on the same day that they ordered it? How much more would they buy from us, right? Could we effectively eliminate them ever needing to go to a physical store and take all of that business ourselves? Those are the kinds of scenarios that, I think are kind of more interesting. It's that future side of this curve. But there's absolutely validity in needing to analyze the past and the present. It's just about zeroing in on what's important in your organization right now. Because there are so many unknowns with analytics, the executives have got to be creative thinkers about what they want from their solutions. But on top of that, I will say the business analysts also have to be creative to help them think of possibilities, right? We want to inspire new ideas. So these are some examples of the kinds of things that we might brainstorm about. We might want to understand, what decisions do they think they want to make and help them expand that pie, right? Maybe just do a brainstorming session where they're all throwing out ideas. You can pare the list down later, but get creative with it. Really understand what problem is it that they're trying to solve, because that will help us kind of hone in on what matters most out of the solution. What are some examples of things that are possible with a solution, right? So they may not even know what's possible. So if you can come up with examples of what other organizations are doing, that might inspire some ideas. Another thing is a lot of companies are buying analytics tools to support this work. You can buy packaged products that help with this. So understand if you have a tool, what does the tool allow you to do? Or if you don't have a tool, just look out there at the top 3 to 5 tools. What do those allow? And again, that might inspire ideas of what the possibilities are. Ask lots of what-if questions. And the other thing is think about maybe you need to expose the data in some way that will help the user explore it, right? They don't know what they don't know, but they know they want to look at some subset of data and start to drill in and learn more. And so maybe you just need to set a system up where they have a bit more flexibility. All right, the nature of analytics projects is that there is a lot of back and forth or iteration in those projects, even after they're deployed, actually. And so we, as people working on the requirements, have got to be ready for that, right? We don't get to do requirements up front and never revisit them. That doesn't work in analytics. In a dream world, I will say that the user asks her question, she gets her data, she runs her analytics, she gets some results, maybe she gets a report that contains information about that decision she has to make. She makes her decision, she acts, and she's done, right? That's the dream world. However, reality is a little bit different than that. The user starts with a question, and we get some data, they run their analytics, they get the report, but when she sees that information, she's now going to think of a new question that will come out and require further analysis, right? That further analysis might require additional data. Those things will change, so we're going to loop back. To really make the point, I will stress that even when they get that first round of information, the first time we go through and get our results, we may not be able to do anything at that point. Immediately, we might have to go back and look at different data or run different analytics, right? So a lot of times, it's just this back and forth of, well, I need to see something else, and so we need to go back to the drawing board and pull in different information. Our director of marketing was joking with me the other day that our president of our company does this to her literally every week, and I think this is pretty common, right? He looks at our marketing metrics, he notices what's interesting or not, and then he starts to wonder about the next thing. And without fail, every week he says, okay, can you go back and add this other thing to the report, or maybe you can tweak it? I want to see something else next week. This literally happens every week. And I think that that is very typical. People, particularly at that executive level, that is absolutely how they operate. They're excited to get what you showed them, and now they want to see the next thing. So given that iterative nature and all of these unknowns, the key to defining requirements for these projects is to start somewhere, okay? So because the requirements might change over time, begin with what the stakeholder already knows that they want to learn from the information, and plan for that question to evolve accordingly. So we start somewhere. What one question do we know they want to answer right away? What one decision do we think they want to make immediately? Start there and build out from it. The second thing is talk to them about how much they think that's going to change, okay? So this is you trying to figure out how much flexibility do they need in their solution, right? They may think that right now they're pretty close to knowing what they actually want out of the full solution eventually. That's a little bit of change. Or maybe they know that their business analytics solution is going to change significantly over time. They might want a solution that they can easily adapt, and that requires a minimal amount of additional development work to make that happen. These are the systems where you're exposing more data and more flexibility in the user interface. All right. I'd like to finish up with the presentation part of this with a couple things that I think you can do to immediately action change in your projects. This is one of the most important takeaways that you can use on any project, not just an analytics project. So I really want this to sit in with you guys. So people are not looking at data for fun. That means they don't need reports just in case they want to look at them later. So if you're hearing that, that's a great opportunity for you to push back and cut scope. Right? They need to identify what are the report requirements that they actually need, right? What decisions do they want to make from that data, and let that drive the actual reporting requirements. Okay? So remember that people don't look at data for fun. They use it to make decisions. Here are some requirements models that you can use on your projects. I showed you a couple of these today. We looked at the decision requirements diagram, the decision tree, and the decision table. The other ones are ones that you can find a reference to on our website. The exception would be that decision requirements diagram. I mentioned that that came from a company. It's called Decision Management Solutions. And again, I have that information at the end of the webinar for you as well. There are a couple of pitfalls around analytics projects that you can keep in mind as you're working on them. Okay? The first one, the effects are real-time often. So think about how fast information is propagated within the internet, and that leads you to understand why it's real-time. Many of you have probably heard the story of a recent PR executive who sent a tweet and shut off her phone and then flew to South Africa. By the time she landed, so this is an overseas flight, and by the time she landed, her tweet was all over the international media. Okay? It was a really insensitive tweet, and there's some irony in the fact that she was a PR executive, that the combination of those things, I think people just took off with that story. But my point here is the internet makes things really, very real time. So the effects of an analytics project or something the analytics are doing can be fast, but they can also be very harmful if it goes wrong. Right? You could very quickly ruin a brand. You might violate privacy issues and end up in a legal situation and so on. So you need to be very careful about what you're doing and keeping in mind those effects are going to be real time potentially. Closely related to that, you want to be careful to not automate something in the wrong way. So here's an example of this. There is software that scans social media and makes stock trade movements accordingly. And in 2013, there was an incorrect social media report that went out that President Obama was actually injured in an explosion. This caused one of these systems to start selling stocks. That led to other systems to start selling stocks, right? And they saw the markets decline, and they're all reacting accordingly. And all of this because of a news release, and in this case, an incorrect news release, right? Very, very dangerous. Now, fortunately, in this particular story, the hoax was discovered quickly, and humans could intervene and reverse the behavior of these decisions before it got too bad. But I share this example because even though the software was likely behaving as it was built, it was not behaving as it was desired, and that's because it wasn't really thought through, okay? This is the job of a business analyst as a BA. They've got to find these edge cases in the requirements and plan for them, right? Plan for as best you can what might happen that we're not thinking of. Now, finally, this is something you can do immediately as a BA. Be careful about what you're allowing teams to prioritize. So if you don't do prior for requirements efforts on these projects, you can spend a lot of time building a complex analytic solution that doesn't allow you to answer the questions that really matter to the organization. All right, finally, here's some recommended reading for you. If you're new to this topic or you're working on a project, there's a lot of interesting information out there that I found to be particularly helpful. Now, the top two, I'm going to be honest, I am completely biased about these, actually the top 3 bullet points, but I'll at least point you to what's useful within them if you want to look at either one of them. So in this software requirements book, the 3rd edition, Karl Wiegers and I published this in 2013. Chapter 25 is only on business analytics projects. That's the entire focus of that chapter. So a lot of what you saw today would be familiar if you picked up a copy of that book. The data models that I referenced, in fact, all the visual models that I referenced are going to be mentioned in the visual models book, that 2nd link. So those data models are probably the most relevant, but there's some others that are useful there. We also have a white paper on our homepage at seilevel.com that you could download that summarizes a lot of what I've covered today. Now, the second set of books here, that first one that I mentioned I think is a really nice overview if you just want to get a handle on what big data is. The next one, I will tell you, Tom Davenport, one of the authors on that book, has written a lot on this topic. I think he's one of the most interesting authors I've actually read. He has a ton of stuff on this topic, a lot of variety. They're all good. This is just one of my favorites that kind of pops out at me. There's also a lot of interesting blogs out there. I will tell you, I think it's useful to start reading things like Harvard Business Review, just start to skim the information that comes out of there. They have a lot on this topic. The International Institute of Analytics, same thing. They've got some of the most interesting. And then James Taylor, his website is linked here as well, and he's focused on decisions and that aspect of what I covered today. All right, and with that, that's the end of my presentation, but I think we have some time for questions still. So Audra, I think, is going to help me monitor some of those. Sorry, I couldn't think of the word. And let's see what our first few are. Sorry, and Audra, I don't know if you're expecting me to read them, but I will.
I can go ahead and read off the first one. Okay. There's a question here from Steven, and it goes back to the customer in the aisle, and he wanted to know how would it scale to 10 customers in an aisle?
Okay, so Steven, great question. And keep in mind I've kind of made up the scenario just to demonstrate the purposes, but if it were my store in my aisles, I think what you have to do is, a couple things. You could have multiple scanning and TVs throughout your store, so you're hitting more customers at once, and realize that you're not going to hit every single customer that comes and walks by the visual scanning thing. the other, as with, and I'm going to say this is true of pretty much any software project, you can go in and approach it iteratively. So you roll out where you have one TV that's right at the entrance of your store. And then maybe, in a couple months' time you add 10 more and so on. The other thing is that they can actually really pay attention to the traffic in the store. I had talked about in that example that you would have some of the know-how around what is the traffic volume in my store. And I could just use standard traffic volume to pick smaller, shorter ads when I have high volume traffic. But in theory, I could actually start to pay attention to how many people are in my store at this moment. Don't go with reliable history, just go with real-time data and says, okay, I've got 100 people in the store right now. I need to show 2-second ads. When I only have 20 people in the store, I'm going to show 10-second ads, right? That kind of thing. So those are just some of the variety of options that people would have, I think. All right. Let's see here. And there's a question here from Andrew. Is there a way to add structured data? Let me address that because I think the nature of, and I'm hoping I understand Andrew's question correctly, but the nature of big data, like I mentioned, often it's going to be unstructured or semi-structured. And I think absolutely that you can start to take some of that semi-structured data and add structure to it, right? You can take the metadata and start to pull out those pieces of it. Maybe of the full data set you have, only 20% of it is what you care about. So maybe something comes over where you have 3 fields and then some unstructured parts to it, and you really only care about those 3 fields, and that's fine. That's part of us transforming the data before we store it, maybe to figure out what's actually relevant or what's not relevant to it. All right. Hey, Audra, are you still there? Because I only see 2 questions. I feel like I'm missing some, and I know you said there were more.
Actually, there's just one more question here. So, folks, if you have any questions, now is the time to get them into Joy. Take advantage of having an expert here. So if you wanted to go ahead and answer Edward's question, which is, what is the most interesting project for you where you provided big data requirements for your customers?
That's a tough one. Interesting project. It can be interesting in so many different ways, right? Because it may have nothing to do with the data. It may have more to do with the people and the challenges around the project. I feel like we're seeing and I also don't want to necessarily talk about I don't want to reveal things about our projects necessarily, but I think there's some interesting one. There's a technology company that comes to mind where, you can imagine if you've got hundreds of thousands of people hitting a website every day, and it's a technology company that's selling products to their customers out of that. And I feel like, to me, that is one of the most interesting spaces, is to look at that marketing aspect of what can I do with the big data. And so I can monitor everything from, like where the mouse is hovering. What are they looking at, even if they don't actually ever put it in their cart and things like that. So to me, I think that's probably where the most interesting stuff has been, and that's probably somewhat the nature of the work that we've done. I actually haven't done much in the medical space, but I think that probably would be some of the most interesting places to it. I just personally haven't done it. And I'm not talking about specifically the insurance. I'm talking more about, like the diagnostics and things like that, learning, using the massive amounts of information out there to better diagnose people quicker. All right. I'm looking here. Oh, and I think, oops, I'm in the wrong one. Do we have any other questions coming in?
Yeah, so Stephen wants to know, have you encountered siloing, I think I said the word correctly, of data siloing of data within companies, and as if, how did you get it solved?
It's kind of funny. So Stephen, I think I understand what you're asking, and what I will say is that I've seen some of that, but the nature of a lot of the organizations we're working with, I think, are maybe a bit more immature in what they're doing with their data, but the nature of that is it makes the solutions right now a little bit easier. And what I'm seeing is that they're So the data may be siloed, but the solutions that they're trying to put in place are more looking at those data silos, right? So, maybe part of the organization has got all of the customer information. And so they're doing analytics on that and not necessarily yet reaching out into the other spaces. I think that what's going to happen, though, is we're going to see a shift towards more and more companies needing to cross-reference that data in different parts of the organization. And so we're going to have people in that data space trying to figure out how do I bring these sources together and, basically transform them so I can do analysis on them, even though they're from totally disparate places. We were just talking about this in my office yesterday that one of our customers, so we had somebody who had it's just one of the things where he had maybe a bad experience. So he was shopping for something, it didn't go well. He opted not to buy the thing that he was actually had in his cart, so that's called cart abandonment, right? And went off and bought something else somewhere else. And it probably will never go buy from this person again. So the question is, in that scenario, somebody is looking, on an analytics team, is looking at that data and knowing what is our cart abandonment rate, where are the problems happening, and probably can zero in actually why it's happening. This is all statistics-based, right? They're not looking at the one guy. They're looking at over time, this is what's happening. So there's, oftentimes I think there's a part of the organization that's looking at that data and actually knows a lot about the data, but a totally different part of the organization is responsible for the website that guy was on. The question is that link happening where the people who are doing that analysis are actually able to get back to the people who effectively product manage that website so that they can start to make changes? And my experience is in a lot of companies that's still very immature. And so the team who's deciding here are the changes we're going to make to the website is really given only maybe some glimpses into what those results are, what the patterns are, or maybe somebody much higher up has decided, just go fix these one or two things, and so they actually don't know the whole story behind it. And so I think that I guess what I'm saying is I think that companies have got a long ways to go. Not all, but many have a long ways to go where they're actually doing better sharing of that information, right? So the analytics results is actually in the hands of the people working on the website. It's not that they're getting it through email or from their boss passing it down. They're actually able to look at those results themselves and know, okay, let me play around with this kind of stuff. So I think we're moving that way. I think analytic solutions out there are going to help that along. I just don't think we're there yet. Okay, let's see. So I'm just skimming here the questions real quick, Audra, if you want me to just pick one.
Okay, sure, yeah, go ahead. We have 3 more.
Yep. Okay, so how does one separate themselves from a BA and data scientist? Do you think they can become one and the same for particular projects? Okay, great question. I think that the answer to that is on some projects, yes, they can be one and the same. And on some projects, absolutely not. Probably they won't be. And what I mean by that is I think, so let me just talk about it from my own personal experiences. I feel like I've been doing business analysis for a very long time, and I'm very solid at it, and I understand the ins and outs of this topic. That said, I know there are people who have done an entire PhD around data and analyzing it, looking at it, and they're much faster and better than me at it. So in certain scenarios, I would always want to rely on somebody with that kind of expertise. But there are a lot of projects where, when I was doing, I shared the example a little bit ago about the sales VPs who were wanting to do some analysis on their organizations. In that particular case, we didn't really need a data scientist. I had somebody who could, more quickly manipulate what was going on and tell me what the options were, but for the most part, the BAs were doing all of that thinking. So I think it really depends on the complexity of the data and the complexity of what they want to do with the data as to whether they will ever merge. But on the simpler side, I think that the BA could do it all. I will also, I guess I didn't say this, but I'll make it very clear, I don't think the data scientist will necessarily ever be the BA, because I think the business analyst resource has a very specific skill set that all software IT projects need, and that's around what kinds of questions to ask to get those requirements, how to model those requirements and how to get them down on paper. So that role I don't think is going to go away. It's just a matter of whether they can play the BA project or not. Or BA, sorry, whether they can play the data scientist role or not. Okay, let's see. All right, So experience with the customer's domain seems very important in order to structure our data. How would you mitigate lack of experience? This is actually an interesting question. So this is, and I'm probably going to say this wrong, it's Valentin's question. So I think this question actually to me applies to whether you're working with big data and analytics or not. I will tell you that, okay, I'm going to answer this in two ways. I'm going to tell you that I come from a space in the professional services world where often we don't have domain experience. And so we have a lot of experience on trying to figure out how to make it work when you don't know the domain up front. What I will tell you is somebody who is really good at business analysis is absolutely able to get up to speed on the domain, the parts of the domain that matter very, very quickly, and that's how they overcome this. And a lot of times, you know, you start out and you try things and you iterate on the requirements as you go, working with people who do know the domain. So never would I recommend that, you know, there's a project out there trying to do this where no one on the project knows anything about the domain. I think that would be very dangerous, but I think as a BA, you can come in and learn that domain pretty quickly. There's also, just as a side note, there's some interesting research done on domain experience and domain knowledge and the necessity of that by some folks out of University of Waterloo, I think. Dan Barry is the guy leading this. And he's gone off and done a study that shows, you know, what kind of domain experience do you need, and does domain experience hinder you? Because domain experience actually can effectively, you lose some of your creative thinking because you think you know the answers already. And so he did a study to show, you know, he compared teams that had no domain experience to those that had only people with domain experience to those that were blended. And to summarize very quickly is that the blended teams are actually the most successful in defining requirements. All right, and I think let's do one more question if we have time for that. So do you think big data and analytics is the way of the future for higher education? For example, who is the target as a prospect student, what information to send them, and et cetera? That's a big question, a great question. And I'm not sure I'm even capable of giving it due justice, but I will tell you my opinion on this is absolutely it's the way of the future. I feel like what we're going to see, and we're starting to see it, is you're going to see more online options for courses. So that's moving, that's not necessarily big data and analytics, but that's universities are moving towards using the internet to make education happen. And the natural thing that will follow that, just like I showed in an early slide, the internet leads us to lots more data so that we can make more informed decisions. And I feel like universities are going to start to pay more attention to who is coming. Okay, who's not coming? How do I go get them as a student? And so I think that potentially I would expect to see the prospective students' base broadens very significantly, both in age but also in breadth, right? People who maybe today don't feel like it's an option to move away and go to college, and there's not one in your hometown, will have that option, just as a very simple example. So anyway, so I think that we're headed down that page. I think the first step is to move the universities towards the online space, and I see that. You know, I look around me and I see people all the time taking online courses. And so with that, what will follow from that is big data and better targeting and broader application. All right. I think, Audra, I think that may be a good stopping point.
Yes, actually, that's exactly where we'll end today. And is there anything you'd like to leave the audience before we finish up? I have up here on my screen, I welcome anybody to reach out to me if you have further questions or, something interesting or you want to chat about out of today. So absolutely, you can drop me an email. I appreciate you all coming and listening, and great questions from the audience, so thank you. Thank you so much, Joy, for a fantastic presentation, and thank you all for joining us today. And we did push out Joy's book here, so Software Requirements 3, it's the 3rd edition. You could get that for 50% off the ebook and 40% off the print, and use the code MSDEAL, so MSDEAL. All right, so thanks again, Joy, and it was a pleasure. Have a good morning, afternoon, and evening to you all for wherever you are from. Goodbye.